we start to get into the May time frame, May and June, we start to see some caddis activity. The interesting thing about caddis in a tailwater situation is they occur much later in the year than on our freestone streams. Typically, like the brachycentrus caddis that we see on some of our freestone streams in the Rocky Mountains, tend to hatch around Mother's Day, and that's why it's dubbed as the Mother's Day caddis hatch. In our tail race situations, typically it takes much longer for the water to warm up. Does that make sense? Because a lot of times it's coming off the bottom, a lot of times it's in the 40-degree range. Caddis need that 52 to 54-degree range to pupate. So it takes later into the season before we start to see that occur. One of the interesting things, though, however, is there's always exceptions to the rule. And like in my home river, and it won't be the case this year because our snowpack is so down. I'm not sure what your guys' pack is here, but we're in a drought on the other side of the hill here. We're at about 66% snowpack on the South Platte corridor. So we're not going to see our reservoir spill this year. Oftentimes, if our reservoir spills, then we have warmer surface water that's coming over the top, mixing with the water on the bottom, and then that can jump that water temperature up and can trigger some of our caddis hatches to occur earlier in the year. But that's not going to be the case on this season. So this is a Tiemco 200R, and instead of using the extra small bead, I'm going to use a small bead here. So what I'm going to attempt to tie here is what I call the Mercury caddis. And this is just a little brachycentrus caddis. I'm sure in past you have caught one of these little twigs, one of these little cased caddises on the end of your fly, and if you squeeze them, inside the little larva is actually inside of the casing itself. Now what's interesting is these guys become victims of behavioral drift. So if they become overcrowded in a certain area, they're going to move to another location. If we get a small increase in flow, they're going to move. They might get dislodged. So fish will root them off branches, root them off rocks, so on and so forth. We're going to begin with some 8/10 thread. Let's see if I can get this re-threaded here. We'll begin about mid-shank, and then we're going to use some hare's mask dubbing for the casing, and we're going to use some ice dub for the larva inside the casing, and then some black hare's mask for the head. Just like a hare's ear, I think one of the most important attributes to this pattern is making it look buggy. So what I do is I typically prefer, when I'm using hare's mask dubbing of any sort, rather than buying a pre-made package of it off the shelf, I prefer to mix my own up. So I have a coffee grinder on my fly tying table, and then I'll get a hare's mask, and then I can control the amount of underfur that I put in my dubbing and the amount of guard hairs that I put in my dubbing. And I typically like a very spiky, very healthy amount of guard hairs in this particular pattern, as I do, as I mentioned, on my hare's ear. The buggier the better. And that's a little bit more on the challenging side with regard to dubbing. And if you prefer, you can use some wax with this. We're going to start right back towards the rearward part of that hook, and then we're going to start moving forward here. And I typically will dub this in 2 or 3 different layers to try to accomplish the taper to this fly. I'm going to add just a little bit more. There's some of those guard hairs sticking out on the monitor, can you see? Oh yeah. So we're going to come up to right about here. I'm going to advance the thread back forward, and we'll come back in with another layer. And then we'll start a little bit in front of that point there, and then just, again, try to establish a little bit more taper. Just like that. Now we'll take a little bit of the dubbing, as I mentioned, to make the larva. And this is going to be the trigger on this particular pattern. A lot of times the fish will key on the actual chartreuse looking larva. I'm going to take a little bit of that dubbing right there and put that right in front of the casing. So sometimes you'll hear people refer to these as peaking caddis. And then we'll take a little bit of the hare's mask dubbing and then dub that right behind the mercury bead there. So if you look at caddis, one of the prominent features with them is the black head. You'll notice that I used tan thread, and that's so that you won't see the thread in the actual dubbing process. And like what I did with the mercury blood midge, I'll come back in with my Sharpie. I'm going to color my thread here black so it'll blend right in with that head. Now what I do for a tungsten variation of this fly is I'm going to swap a 2.8 tungsten bead for this dubbing. So what I'll do is I'll put the mercury bead on first. I'm going to take a tungsten bead and I'm going to turn it backwards so that the countersunk side is going to butt right up with the bead. Does that make sense? Because when you look at a tungsten bead, or a brass bead for that matter, there's a small side and a big side. So if you turn it backwards, you slide it up. So now you got the merc bead, you'd have your tungsten bead sitting here, and then you would tie this fly exactly the same. So that gives you a standard mercury bead, caddis, and then the tungsten variation as well. So.